Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is July 26, 2024, Friday, July 26, 2024. Like usual, we're going to start off with stranger than fiction stories. This is titled Mary of Magdala, which her feast day was 4 days ago on the 22nd. A small town in France is the destination of thousands of pilgrims every year. The faithful all come to pray before the reliquary of a saint that some say was Jesus' closest apostle, and possibly his wife. There is a grotto in Saint-Maximin les Saints-Baumes, large enough to house a medieval basilica, where the bones of Saint Mary Magdalene are encased. Her tomb is considered the third vault of Christendom, after the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem and St. Peter's tomb under the basilica in Rome. The place was once a Roman agricultural farm known as Via Lata. The remains of the structure were found beneath the Place Malherbe. After the death of Maximin, it was renamed to Saint Maximin les Saints-Baumes. In the 13th century, Charles II, King of Naples and Count of Provence, sought out her burial place at Saint Maximin, driven, he said, by a dream he had of Mary Magdalene. Her bones had lain undisturbed for hundreds of years. He found her under a small chapel in a forest in December 1279. Inside a marble sarcophagus was a papyrus that read, quote, "The year of the birth of the Lord, 710, the 6th day of December, at night and very secretly, under the reign of the very pious Eudes, or Udis, king of the Franks, during the time of the ravages of the treacherous nation of the Saracens, the body of the dear and venerable Saint Mary Magdalene was, for fear of the said treacherous nation, moved from her alabaster tomb to the marble tomb, after having removed the body of Sidonius, because it was more hidden." End quote. A wax-covered tablet proclaimed, I'm not even going to try to say this in Latin, which translates, "Here is the body of the Blessed Mary Magdalene." Eudes, or Odo in German, died on January 1st, 898. He was the first king of the West Franks, which is France, and the Capetian kings of France descended from him. No doubt the reliquary was also hidden from the Vikings, which were besieging the area during those years and against which he won several battles. The blackened skull, which was missing the lower mandible, lay inside a golden reliquary with flowing hair. The missing jaw was located in St. John Lateran in Rome. It was returned on April 6, 1295. Her lower leg bones were also missing. Charles II found the priory Saint-Baume and the basilica Sainte Marie Magdalene, which was consecrated in 1316. But due to the scourge of the Black Death, work was stopped until 1404. The project was completed in 1532. Boniface VIII gave it a papal blessing and placed it on the responsibility of the Dominican monks. According to Magdalene Publishing, quote, "Tradition has it that after the execution of St. James in Jerusalem, son of Zebedee and Mary Salome, Mary Magdalene, her sister Martha, and brother Lazarus were persecuted by the Jews of Jerusalem and imprisoned. The Jews were afraid of the crowd if they were to execute the prisoners, so they towed them off the shores of Palestine in a boat without sails or oars or supplies, and abandoned them to the open sea. Others in the boat included Mary Jacob, mother of James and the sister of the Virgin Mary, Mary Salome, mother of the apostles James and John, Maximine, one of the 72 disciples of Christ, Sidonius, the blind man who was miraculously healed by Jesus, Marcel, Martha's servant, and Sarah, maid of the two Marys. After narrowly escaping death during a storm at sea, the boat finally came to shore on the coast of Gaul, in a town now called Sainte Marie de la Mer in Camargue. Mary Jacob, Mary Salome, and Sarah remained in Camargue. Martha traveled towards Avignon and ended up in Tarascon. Mary Magdalene, Lazarus, Maximine, and Sidonius traveled on to Marseille, where Mary Magdalene began to preach. They ended up converting the whole of Provence. Lazarus became the first bishop of Marseille. Mary Magdalene then went on to Aix, where Maximine had already gone. some 20 miles north of Marseille. End quote. Maximine became the first bishop of Aix, and Mary Magdalene retired to a cave at the top of the St. Bon Mountains, where she spent the last 30 years of her life. The place where she took refuge would later become the Sanctuary of Mary Magdalene, a hidden monastery about 15 miles outside of St. Maximine. There was a Gallo-Roman crypt already under the basilica. Besides the reliquary of Mary Magdalene, there are also sarcophagi of St. Maximine, St. Marcel, St. Suzanne, and St. Sidoine. Mary Jacob, Mary Salome, and Sarah are buried in the parish church in St. Marie de la Mer. Martha is buried in St. Martha's Church in Tarascon, and the skull of Lazarus is in a reliquary at Cathedral of St. Mary Major in Marseille. The path to the sanctuary is worn away, trod by thousands for 1,000 years, as they brought their prayers to the Magdalene. Common men and nobility made the pilgrimage. King Louis XI visited twice in 1447 and 1456. His prayers were answered when his son Charles VIII was born in 1470. During the French Revolution, when many sacred places were desecrated, the statue of St. Magdalene in Rapture was hidden in the town of Plan des Opes, but not before French revolutionary figure Paul-François Jean-Nicolas, Vicomte de Barras, stole some of it in 1794, along with precious jewels and the valuables surrounding the relics. Despite being born into an aristocratic family, he voted to have Louis XVI beheaded. He was alleged to have dozens of mistresses and male lovers, and was known as a corrupt man in both his public and private life. During this time when the saint's bones were taken by him, he wrote that ancient genealogies must needs be forgotten. Barras' family, like many of the Catholic nobility, fled to rural Louisiana. He ended his days in luxury, but first confined to his chateau, then exiled. After death, his memoirs were censored. What was left of the Magdalene was the skull, some bones, and hair. This was kept safe because a sign was placed over the door to the basilica that said, "Military supplies." One of the teeth circulated its way around the world and has been on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in an extremely ornate reliquary since 1917. The tooth is enclosed inside a rock crystal. The tomb of Mary Magdalene was not the only one to be attacked during the French Revolution. In 1793, the Royal Chapel at Saint-Denis, north of Paris, was ransacked by a mob who pulled the remains of ancient kings from their tombs, mutilated them, and threw them into a pit. For the next 200 years, there was a severed head, said to belong to Henry IV, who was assassinated in 1610. The head was bought and sold at auctions and kept in private collections. In 2010, forensic scientists who examined it concluded the head did belong to the 7th century French king. His identity could not be established through mDNA because of too much handling. However, an X-ray found a 0.02-inch bone lesion in the upper left jawbone, which corresponded with a wound he received in 1594 in a previous assassination attempt. There were 3 clear cuts to the neck bones, which corresponded to an attempt by a revolutionary in 1793 to behead the king's corpse. With this technology, the skeleton of other kings and queens lying in the mass grave of the basilica could be identified and returned to their tombs. Dr. Philippe Charlier completed the examination. Previously, he found that bones supposed to belong to Joan of Arc and authenticated in 1909 by papal commission were in reality the remnants of an Egyptian mummy and a cat. In 2016, a paper was published by the International Journal of Sciences in which mitochondrial DNA taken from one capillary bulb on one of the Magdalene's hairs was examined. The corresponding haplogroup is K, subclade K1A1B1A. As this subclade, or clade, I don't know how to pronounce that, is the mtDNA genetic signature of ancient Jews that confirms the Pharygian maternal origin of Marie Magdalene indicated in some traditions. In 2017, the skull was re-examined, something that had not been done since 1974. Philippe Charlier, a biological anthropologist from the University of Versailles, and Philippe Foresh, a visual forensic artist, used a computer 3D program to reconstruct the Magdalene's face. They used 500 photographs taken at different angles. The skull was not removed from the glass case. Based on the reconstruction, the skull was estimated to belong to a woman of 50 years of age from Mediterranean descent. The hair that had been on the skull was dark brown. There were particles of clay still attached to the hair and skull, which are consistent with clay used at that time to prevent lice. There has always been a question if Mary Magdalene was not only Jesus' disciple, but his spouse as well. The New Testament describes how Jesus cast out 7 devils from her. She was present at his crucifixion and was the first to see him after he came back to life. The second part of her name, Magdalene, references her town of origin, which was Magdala, a village on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. The Gospel of Mary was declared heretical and destroyed. Only fragments of 5th century papyrus survived and was discovered in 1896. Many argue the Bible has been edited to omit Mary Magdalene's role at Jesus' side. However, she is mentioned in all 4 Gospels. There's even the question if when she fled from Jewish persecution, she was accompanied by their child. Her image as a prostitute did not emerge until the 5th century, when Pope Gregory I perpetrated this story when he delivered a sermon where he made Mary of Bethany an unnamed hair-washing sinner woman with Mary Magdalene. For good measure, Mary Magdalene was also joined to the portrait of an unnamed woman who was adulterous. Her person could also have been confused with the 6th century story of Mary of Egypt, a reformed prostitute. It was from this point on that Mary Magdalene emerged as a repentant prostitute. 1,500 years passed before this portrayal was rejected by the Catholic Church. There is no reference in the Bible where she is described as a prostitute. The Eastern Orthodox religion tells where she died in the Greek city of Ephesus. A relic resides in the Simonopetra monastery on Mount Athos, which is supposed to be her incorruptible left hand. In 866, the rest of her remains were taken to Constantinople, once Istanbul, and buried at a monastery at the Church of Lazarus. Present day, a crypt under a glass dome protects her remains. St. Mary Magdalene's feast day is July 22nd, and a mass and procession with her relics parades through the streets of Saint Maximin le Baume. The feast day mass is held the next Sunday after the feast day, unless they both coincide. For hundreds of years, a multitude of pilgrims have come to worship at this sacred place. In 2021, a new pilgrimage dedicated to St. Mary Magdalene was inaugurated. The 10-stage route traces a 147-mile trip taken by the disciples of disciples through Camargue and Provence. It was inaugurated when the Grotto of St. Mary Magdalene, which had been closed since June 2020 for restoration and safety upgrades, was reopened. Where does the truth lie as to the woman Mary of Magdala was when she was alive? Her everyday life was full of choices, as all of ours are, with some having more far-reaching consequences than others. Could she have foreseen her role as an apostle, a wife, maybe an exile, or even a saint? Doubtful. Perhaps the most unexpected circumstance she could have imagined for herself is that after 2,000 years, her memory persists. So there. There's the Catholic Roman version where she's in France. The Orthodox religion places her in Turkey somewhere, or Istanbul. The reconstruction, of the skull, whoever she was, whether she was the Magdalene or not, corresponds with somebody, a woman from the Mediterranean, ancient Jewish. So that part corresponds. The only part I can't get, like when that revolutionary, where you're going after a saint, it's like that they need to destroy everything. I don't get that. I don't get that. And of course, I'm not surprised to see that he was a real deviant. Count Barras was a deviant. But anyway, let's go on to the second story. And this one is also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories. And it's titled The Crazy House Up on the Hill. The cemetery is located off a dirt road on a wooded hillside. The grounds are overgrown, which seems to be the case even when the hospital was active. The cracked identical stones are marked only with an M or an F, and a number. These numbers range through the hundreds to 4 full digits. These were the patients that died in the hospital that went unclaimed by their family. Dixmont State Hospital was founded in 1848 and began as the insane department of the Western Pennsylvania Hospital in Pittsburgh. Dorothea Dix, an activist and known as the Voice of the Mad, secured the funds for the hospital and personally selected the site where the hospital would move to. The land, 7 miles outside of Pittsburgh, was purchased in 1858, and groundbreaking took place on July 19, 1859, with the laying of the cornerstone for Reed Hall, completed in 1862. The asylum was located on a wooded bluff overlooking the Ohio River and spread over a 407-acre campus. The Department of the Insane in the Western Pennsylvania Hospital of Pittsburgh was built to be a self-sufficient institution to care for those suffering from mental illness and diseases of the brain. It had its own farmlands, which included livestock, a post office, and a station on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Besides the hospital staff, butchers, barbers, dentists, and a private security force were employed there. It opened with 113 patients, but soon inmates from almshouses and jails were shipped to the asylum. It was renamed the Western Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane at Dixmont to honor the memory of Dorothea Dix, who not only advocated for the mentally ill, but in 1861 was appointed superintendent of Army nurses during the Civil War. By 1900, it housed 1,200 patients, twice as many as the facilities were meant to hold. The Dixmont Hospital was legally separated from the Western Pennsylvania Hospital in 1907, when it was individually incorporated as the Dixmont Hospital for the Insane. The overcrowding became so severe that in 1911, a Pittsburgh newspaper announced the hospital was not accepting new patients. The story warned that upon arrival, they would be placed on a train and shipped elsewhere. It was primarily state appropriations that enabled the hospital to expand its facilities and care for an increasing number of mentally ill persons over the first 9 decades of its existence. The facility also suffered from financial issues, which began during the Great Depression. In 1945, it was taken over by the Department of Public Welfare. From that date onward, it operated under the name Dixmont State Hospital until it closed in July 1984. The Dixmont campus contained over 80 structures. Many of the unused and obsolete buildings were demolished in 1967. These included many of the buildings which had housed personnel and equipment that allowed the hospital to be self-sufficient. Behind the Hutchinson building was the Rosenweig House, an old white house that originally was home to the hospital superintendents, but was later used as a security office. Near the service entrance on Ohio River Boulevard was the Boiler Building, Reservoir Water Treatment Building, Cold Storage Building, Laundry Building, and the iconic Smokestack. A sewage treatment plant was located adjacent to Tom's Run and still remains today. What was left of the buildings were demolished in 2006 after being left derelict for over 20 years. However, there is one part of the hospital that cannot be sold or repurposed, which is the hospital cemetery. There are over 1,300 graves, including war veterans, who were interred there from 1863 to 1937. Even the dead pets belonging to superintendents found a spot in the graveyard. However, unlike the patients, their headstones are etched with a name. Most of the patients were buried in wicker coffins and pine boxes. The graves were dug in straight lines, but today the lines aren't so straight. They have slowly been sliding just as the rest of that hospital has been subject to the laws of gravity. The burial records at Dixmont show the first burial occurred May 26, 1863, and the last on March 8, 1937. It's not clear where patients were buried between 1937 and the hospital's closure in 1984. When notices for families to claim relatives' bodies went unanswered, as did those saying that patients were well and ready to be released, they were interred in this graveyard. Present-day Joseph Steffi's headstone stands out as the only one with a name. He died June 1, 1881, at age 40. Steffi might have been a Civil War veteran, earning him the honor of a marker. The cemetery could contain 2 Civil War graves belonging to Confederate soldiers who were brought north on prison trains bound for Elmira, New York, and offloaded in Pittsburgh because of illness. It's unknown if their families ever knew what happened to them. Another who is interred at Dixmont is Minnie Adams, whose tombstone only bears the number 948. Her sad story is more well known due to the circumstances that brought her to Dixmont. She was born in 1891, one of several children in an impoverished household. Her parents were illiterate, and her mother died when Minnie was 6 years old from a strange fever. The children were not sent to school and instead worked on the family farm. When she was 9 years old, she lived with her grandmother, father, and four brothers. In 1901, she lost a younger brother, and the following years, her grandmother died, leaving her the only female in the house. Minnie's story came to the public's attention in 1912 when the local newspapers wrote stories about the wild girl of Brush Valley Township. She was seen by the neighbors in the area wandering in the woods barely dressed. Authorities came to her home and found her inside a room with a door nailed shut. Her father said she had cut off her hair with a butcher knife and that he locked her away because he was afraid of her. Minnie was also described as mute since she would not speak to anyone. She was taken to Dixmont and died on April 7, 1918, from tuberculosis when she was 27 years old. Her father died the previous year. Minnie's death coincided with an influx of soldiers returning from World War I, with what was called shell shock. The already overcrowded hospital had to line the hallways with beds in order to accommodate all the patients. Unlike her parents and her siblings, who were buried in Brush Valley Lutheran Cemetery, Minnie was relegated to a Dixmont grave with only a number as a memorial. Not only the patients found their last resting place at Dixmont, but the staff as well. In 1907, nurse Mary Barley, 25, was struck and instantly killed by an express train at the Dixmont station. She was originally from Morganton, North Carolina, but was not taken home for burial. Death also visited the patients at Dixmont, not through disease or maltreatment, but through the hands of other inmates. In 1896, Henry Heinbog and Samuel Wallace were considered harmless patients and allowed to share a room. On the night of August 29, Heinbog took a zinc basin and crushed Wallace's skull while he slept. He had been sent to Dixmont in 1895. However, Heinbog was no stranger to violence. In 1878, he attacked John Cameron by hitting him on the head with a stone. He was arrested and charged with assault and battery and sentenced to 1 month in jail. It's unknown what eventually landed him in Dixmont, but most probably it was his propensity for violence. Wallace's murder triggered discourse over the overcrowded conditions at Dixmont, which had put both men together in one room. There is no record of Wallace's burial at Dixmont. However, Heinbog died the following year, age 47, and was buried in the hospital cemetery. In 1867, Annie Ballou, considered an incurable patient, escaped from her fourth-floor room after she used a hairpin to remove the wooden strip from the window. She opened the iron grating 10 inches, tied towels together, and fastened one end to a water pipe, with the intent of reaching the ground. She didn't calculate the distance, and after forcing herself through the opening, fell to the ground below. She had no broken bones, but died from what was believed to be internal injuries. She was buried at Dixmont. If she was buried at Dixmont, it was not recorded. There were others who came to the hospital, and their story is a mystery. Jonathan Jameson was born in 1841 in Ireland. He ended his days at Dixmont in 1888 at the age of 47. However, in 1880, he was living at home with his wife and children. What happened in those years that brought Jameson to Dixmont? He served in the 63rd and 105th Pennsylvania Volunteers and was wounded in battle on 3 occasions by the time he was honorably discharged in 1865. Perhaps it was his experiences during the war that eventually stole his sanity. As of 2006, the hospital had been demolished, even though the Kirkbride building was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1980. The precarious nature of the hill that it rested on proved to be a challenge for developers who hoped to build a Walmart on the site. Eventually, it ended in an engineering disaster. The demolition and clearing of the parcel atop the hill caused a massive landslide in September 2006, which dumped 500,000 cubic yards of soil, rock, and debris onto Route 65. closing it to traffic for some time. 1 year later, Walmart finally abandoned the plans to develop the site and it remains as an empty lot. As of 2012, the site was stabilized, but developers confirmed that construction cannot take place there for several years. From the beginning, the hospital had a reputation for being haunted. The 1862 hospital was haunted by many entities, notably a male spirit who was said to guard the morgue area and frighten away intruders. During modern times, prior to its demolition, when it was occasionally used as a film shoot, there were instances when doors on the morgue doors would slam shut by themselves. Doors that were still on their hinges would also slam shut even on windless days and nights. There was another building which had a warm, fetid smelling breeze coming out of the front entrance of the structure. Now that there's only a memory of the Dixmont Asylum, have these restless spirits been set free, or have they instead moved on to the cemetery where they were unsuccessfully laid to rest? Now, no, I think it's very interesting. Where this, where did they bury everybody after 1937? They closed in 1984, so we're talking here 47. It was almost 50 years. Where did they bury everybody? What? That's that's very interesting. Like, I mean, if they have a cemetery there, why not? Unless there were a lot of, I don't know. That's a mystery. And one thing, seeing that they noticed that even when the families received notices that so and so was well, not that they died, that they were well, like, hey, this person can be picked up and go back home, guess what? Nobody would come to get them. And the reason I bring this up is all these stories about the asylums, everybody, people being held there against their will and all these horrible experiments. And you know what? I've done a lot of research. You'd be surprised how many of these people were left in asylums. Yeah, some were, they were really crazy. I mean, they were insane. They needed to be there. But there was a lot of people that ended up staying in these asylums because the families didn't want them back. In other words, maybe they were peculiar, but they weren't dangerous. Or like they were saying that hey, you can come and get your family. And the families would not come to get them. So this misconception that a lot of people have where, hey, people were held there against their will and blah, 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 and they were experimented on. You'd be surprised, really. Most of the times, the ones who were really responsible for leaving their loved ones, or not so loved ones, in an asylum already overcrowded. How's that? Were the families themselves. Because, like I said, maybe the person was not dangerous, but was, like I said, peculiar, eccentric. But how's this? That maybe even that person, let's say the staff knew this person, we can't let them go because they wouldn't be able to take care of themselves, by themselves, in other words. And in other words, what they needed to be was with their family. So yeah, sometimes we have to look at some historical things and realize that a lot of these tropes of that, I gotta tell you, that asylum thing is not exactly accurate all the time. All right, next story is out of Popular Mechanics, and it's titled, Archaeologists Found Someone They Never Expected in an Ancient Chinese Tomb, a Blonde Man. Right. And I like this because this has a connection to the Silk Road, which, as everybody knows, Marco Polo, the Silk Road. Here we go. A Tang Dynasty tomb decorated with colorful murals is providing a new glimpse into daily life in China during the 8th century. Most interestingly, the murals show signs of Western influence, particularly the inclusion of a blonde bearded figure. A 2018 reconstruction project of a hillside road in the capital of the Zhangzi province led to unearthing the tomb, but archaeologists hadn't really reported on the discovery until now. Long Zhen, director of the Xinjiang Ancient City Research Institute of the Taiwan Cultural Relics Protection Research Institute, says, according to a translation from the state-run news out Xinhua, that the tomb has pairs of figures painted on both sides of the tomb door, and that paintings of people continue throughout the tomb, including everything from women pushing stones to grind flour to men making pasta, women using oranges to fetch water, and men stepping on hammers to help pound rice. Experts believe the tomb was owned by a man who died in 736 AD at age 63 during the middle of the Tang dynasty, which ran from 618 to 907 AD. He was buried in the tomb along with his wife. The 8 scenes painted on the tomb are in the figures under the tree style, trendy at the time, which, not unlike the name suggests, shows daily activities occurring under artistically rendered trees. The scenes offer a fresh view on what daily life and responsibilities were during the Tang dynasty. The figures painted on the tomb all appear to be of the Han ethnicity, except for one, a figure painted with blonde hair and a beard. Victor Xiong, professor of history at Western Michigan University, who wasn't involved in the discovery, said the Westerner painted in the tomb leading camels likely represented someone from Central Asia. Based on his facial features and outfit style, Xiong said, we can identify him as a Westerner, likely a Sogdian from Central Asia. The Sogdian people lived in what is now modern-day Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and were active along the Silk Road trading routes. The murals coat the entire tomb, save for the floor. The South China it was written that the artwork is styled similarly to other Tang-era murals, with strong outlines, simple shading, and two-dimensional artwork. Zen believes the style coincides with the paintings found in the tomb of Wang Shenzi, a key figure in the late 800s during the fall of the Tang dynasty and rise of the Song dynasty. The style so closely matched it may have been the same painter. Not only was the small brick tomb covered in paintings, but the gates, corridor, and tomb pedestal holding the coffins were all adorned as well. The dome ceiling strays from the rest of the motif and features a dragon-like image. Figures painted at the gate may represent guardians with yellow robes and swords tied around their waist. Other scenes include a woman in a brightly colored dress leading 4 horses, while a man stands nearby with a whip. Women and men holding boxes or ceremonial bowls tucked to their chests, and an old man shown in various scenes reaching towards a snake, carrying an axe and firewood, and holding a cup. Excuse me. The paintings The paintings also feature plenty of trees, flowers, mountains, and livestock. Most of the figures throughout the tomb appear to be the same 2 people, leading the archaeologists to surmise they were the owners of the tomb. The scenes painted on the mural offered some never-before-seen examples of Tang-era chores, and because the figures were most likely the owners of the tomb, probably depicted the minutiae of their daily lives. But the Westerner's presence adds a bit of a mystery to the otherwise staid way of living for the long-deceased man and woman. Well, and it's really funny because it's true. Somebody made a comment on the thing, the blind guy, they show him taking a bath. He's, in the different scenes, he's shown him one for, with some horses. Okay. And then he's shown another one in a big tub, while everybody's working there. Very interesting. And by the way, this must have been quite a find. Very interesting. Okay, let's go back to Stranger Than Fiction stories, and this one's titled Death Visits the Claypool Hotel. The Claypool Hotel in Indianapolis once received powerful politicians and even President Lincoln in 1861 when it was the Bates House. However, in the years that followed, it could not escape the stigma of murder that stained its luxurious and upscale reputation. The Bates House, built in 1852, was demolished in 1901, and the Claypool Hotel was built in its place. It had 8 floors and 500 rooms. World War II was raging, and 33-year-old Corporal Maoma Little Ridings checked into room 729 at 4 p.m. to enjoy her weekend leave. 4 hours later, her mutilated, semi-nude body was found sprawled on the floor. She was dressed in a bra, nylon hose, and a brown slip pulled up to her waist. Maoma hailed from Warm Springs, Georgia, from the family who had established Warm Springs, which had formerly been called Bullocksville. Her father, a lawyer and real estate agent, had died in 1925, but her mother may collapse when she received news of her daughter's death. Maoma had been a therapy nurse at Warm Springs Infantile Paralysis Foundation from 1927 to 1931. It was here that she attended future President Roosevelt, who was then governor of New York, when he came for treatment at the center. They had become so close she would call him Uncle Frank. She married Lawrence Ridings in 1931, but after several years together they had divorced, and he went to serve in the Army overseas. Maoma had worked as an auditor for the FHA in Washington before joining the WAC or WAC in February 1943. She had been promoted to corporal. She had just been promoted to corporal. The Claypool was 25 miles away from Camp Atterbury, and she had stayed frequently at this hotel in the last 2 months before she died. Sometimes she was alone, other times with another WAC nurse. The hotel was within a 100-mile radius of 5 Army and Navy camps, making it a center for service people. Corporal Samuel Kaplan, also from Camp Atterbury, who was staying in room 756, later told police that sometime between 6 and 8 p.m., he received an anonymous telephone call from someone who said that a WAC was screaming on the 7th floor and the police should be called. He telephoned the desk. Later, the hotel switchboard operator said other guests complained of hearing a soldier and a woman arguing in another room. When the employees went to the room, it was empty and the soldier had checked out. The corporal's body was found by Lillian McNamara, a housekeeper, who said that the body was nude below the waist. Part of the clothing was on the bed, the shoes on the floor, and the rest of her clothing was in the closet. Her throat, the left side of her face, arms, and wrist were cut with a broken whiskey bottle found at the scene. Some believed it was an attempt to make the murder look like a suicide. The fifth of whiskey was later found to have been purchased by Maoma herself when she got off the bus depot. But she did not have any alcohol in her system. Strangely, the bottom of the whiskey bottle was missing and never found. Other items that were never located were her skirt and the room key. Instead of the local police or the military police being called, the assistant manager told 2 Air Force officers from Stout Field who were on the first floor to come to room 729, which was in a lonely spot of the hotel and flanked by 2 staircases. When they saw the scene of the body lying on the floor between the bed and the door, which by then had been draped with a sheet by the housekeeper, they told the manager they had no authority to handle a murder investigation. The Army immediately sent detectives, but city authorities were also investigating and interviewing personnel and guests. Within a day, the police were looking for a mysterious black-haired woman who had been sitting on the bed smoking a cigarette when a bellhop came to deliver soda. He described that she was wearing a black dress with a white collar, a black hat, and nose veil. She was also seen later in conversation with a uniformed policeman in a service elevator. A hotel employee overheard her say to the officer, "You better go up to a room on the 7th floor. There's a woman dead there. She may have committed suicide or she may have been murdered." The officer replied, "You'd better not stick your neck out. You might be into trouble." He had then gotten off on the 7th floor and the employee took the woman down to the 1st floor. The local police had no report of this woman or the policeman described by the employee. Detectives would go on to interview Ruth Hoover, Maoma's friend and once a WAC, who told them that prior to this last stay at the Claypool, Maoma had partied with a crowd at the Severn Hotel until she was asked to pay for a bed, which broke down during a gay party. She argued with the room clerk and left without paying for it. She said the weekend parties were attended by both enlisted men and officers, which were a continual round of drinking and merrymaking. Ruth said, "We'd run all over the hotel from one room to another, and then we'd go out and eat, and then come back and start all over again. Maoma had only one fault. She liked to drink too much." Ruth did not accompany Maoma on that fateful weekend since she had resigned from the service. She also told police, "I don't believe there's a woman in this picture. Ridings didn't like women. She liked men. She was a happy-go-lucky girl and just out for a good time. I don't see why anyone would want to kill her. I can't understand that she ordered 6 Cokes before she was killed. She usually drank her whiskey straight with a chaser, and I've never known her to drink out of a bottle. It seems to me 6 Cokes was a lot for her to order unless she was expecting company. Corporal Kaplan was also interviewed by the authorities since none of the hotel employees could recall his phone call to the desk. However, the woman in black, seated in the service elevator, was identified as Mary Breitbach, 25, who had been visiting Kaplan. However, the identity of the woman in black visiting with Mahoma remained unidentified. An autopsy found that Mahoma had died from a blow to the head over her left eye and loss of blood. The authorities would not clarify if she had been raped or if a robbery had taken place. The medical examiner said the cut to her neck did not sever the jugular and had not been made by the broken bottle. The next twist into the investigation was when 22-year-old bellhop Robert Wolfington, who had come to the room to deliver ice, was held on a charge of vagrancy when indeed he was being considered a suspect. He had failed to show up for work, claiming he had to get his uniform cleaned. Review of the records sheets for the day of the murder reflected no request for ice to room 729, which is the reason he had presumably gone to the room. The police described him as being intoxicated and emotionally unstable. When being questioned, he was unable to account for all his time on the day of the murder. Wolfington was estranged from his wife and had been medically discharged from the Navy a few months before because he suffered from seizures. He had attempted suicide in July 1942 by ingesting lye and stayed at the hospital for 6 weeks. He told police that when he came to the room with another ice delivery around 6 p.m., the door was slightly ajar, and a voice from the bathroom told him to leave it on the table and take a 25-cent tip that was on the dresser. Another bellhop, Albert Bain Jr., was the one who had seen the lady in black. He delivered 6 bottles of soft drink and some ice to the room 45 minutes after Mahoma checked in. She had paid him $1 for the bill and also gave him a 25-cent tip. He would be the last person to see Mahoma alive before her body was discovered 3 hours later. Later, detectives found a blood clot on the closet floor, indicating that the body might have been in there for a while, possibly when Wolfington arrived and heard the voice of the woman in the bathroom. Once the county coroner confirmed that Mahoma Riding had been sexually assaulted, the police started looking for suspects besides the lady in black seen in the room. Lieutenant Noel Jones, in charge of the detective investigation, was the first to propose that the mysterious lady seen in the room was a man disguised as a woman. Later it was clarified that it was not clear if Mahoma had engaged in consensual sex or had been raped, only that she had been intimate with a man before her death. Many tips came to the police, but most didn't lead anywhere. A man's blood-stained coat and slack were dropped off at a local laundry by a young woman who said she would come back for them later. The stains were discovered after she had left. Later, these items were identified as the property of a war worker who had a nosebleed. Once the police found only 46 cents in the victim's purse, robbery was also considered a motive. Officers and others who knew Mahoma said she was also known to carry large sums of money. By September 2nd, police were considering the crime was possibly committed by more than one person in a moment of blind fury. On September 4th, Mahoma Riding was laid to rest in her hometown of Warm Springs, Georgia. The following day, police arrested Robert de Armand, 40, a kitchen worker who in 1934 had been convicted of attempting to rape a 10-year-old girl. The authorities had good reason to suspect de Armand's possible involvement in the murder. Robert Ora de Armand had once been a teacher at Brookville Township, Indiana, as far back as 1928. He had married Lillian Davidson in 1926, and in 1934, when an affidavit had been filed against him for attempted rape of a child, he was the father of 2 young girls. In 1936, his wife divorced him. He was convicted and sent to the Michigan City State Penitentiary. In 1939, he was transferred to the Central Insane Hospital at Indianapolis. Then in 1941, he stole a vehicle after escaping from the asylum. Authorities at the hospital reported to police that he was dangerous. The police got a tip he was near his home in Laurel and arrested him. He was being transported to the jail in Brookville when he made a lunge from the back seat of the vehicle. He had brought his manacled hands down across the sheriff's head, who was riding in the back with him, and hooked the handcuffs over the knob on the steering wheel, causing the sheriff to lose control of the car. It overturned several times down a steep embankment. The occupants, including Armand, suffered only minor injuries. It turned out he returned to Laurel because he was hunting his ex-wife, with the intention of killing her. Considering his criminal history, it's surprising he was paroled in April 1943 from the Central State Hospital for the Insane, which is when he went to work at the Claiborne Hotel. At night, he worked at the Riverside Amusement Park, which, considering he was a convicted pedophile, was the last place he should have been employed. Since he had reported to work at 7:30 p.m. at the park, and Mahoma was killed about 8:30 p.m., he was released. Dr. Max A. Barr, the superintendent at the hospital who had authorized his release on parole, said he showed marked sexual tendencies, but responded to treatment in a fit manner for release, and he was being supervised by his father. This prognosis turned out to be wrong. In October 1943, he was being returned to prison by a parole officer for violating his parole. While at a restaurant in Lebanon, he jerked away from the officer and fled down the railroad tracks. He was recaptured when he was found hiding in a watchman's shanty. He died in 1982, age 79. Within the next few days of the murder, both Wolfington and Darmond were freed, and the search for the woman in black continued. The same housekeeper who had found the body found that a screen had been forcibly removed from a 7th-floor window that opened onto the fire escape. It had been opened with sufficient force to sliver the wood frame around it. She quit soon after this last discovery. The police also investigated a 19-year-old chambermaid who had worked on the 7th floor, who had suddenly quit her job 2 days before. The prosecutors had concluded that Mahoma had known her killer. They based this conclusion on the fact that the hotel room door would automatically lock, and the murderer either had a key or had been allowed entry by the victim. They surmised that her attacker had struck her across the head, raped her, and then panicked and cut her body in an effort to make it look like a suicide. They also concluded that the room, which was located in a remote part of the 7th floor, adjacent to 2 stairways, had facilitated the murderer to enter and leave without being seen. 7 days after the crime, police still had failed to apprehend the murderer. They were checking the trash behind the hotel when they found a discharge notice from the Army, along with a Masonic emblem with the same name. This clue was speedily shelved when a letter Parton code was found in the chandelier of room 729. It was found after the prosecutors and deputies started using the room as a command center while they conducted their investigation. It was later discarded as it had been written by a shoe salesman who had been filling out an order, made a mistake, and had thrown it over his shoulder where it landed in the chandelier. Even a spiritualist got in on the act, and she called police and told them she was close to a solution, but her contact with the spirit world was suddenly broken. The prosecutors told the newspapers that they were looking to find a mystery man who was an acquaintance of Mahoma and who had visited the room shortly before her murder. Later, Corporal Emmanuel Fisher was found to have come to the hotel, called several times to the room from the lobby, and got no answer until the detective answered the phone. He hung up thinking that Mahoma decided to meet another man for a date. As the police investigated Mahoma's background, they received information that she had a divorced friend who frequently dressed in black, who she would party with during her weekends in the city. But they were unable to locate this woman, and the investigation came to a standstill until October 1944. William Llewellyn, an Indiana state convict, confessed to the killing and initially implicated his ex-wife, Winona Kidd Llewellyn, who he said was the lady in black. He said the murder had taken place after a wild party in the room. Supposedly he had arrived at the hotel room and found both women drinking and smoking marijuana. Later his wife became jealous and attacked Ridings, at which time he left the hotel but heard the sound of breaking glass. His wife, who had been under arrest in Tennessee for burglary charges, was eventually cleared of suspicion, as it was found she was working in Knoxville at the time of the murder. Llewellyn's confession was eventually dismissed. He was one of 4 persons who had made a similar admission. 3 of them were found to be mentally unbalanced. Llewellyn was serving 10 to 20 years at Indiana State Prison for various burglaries. The years went by, and every time a suspect was apprehended for a similar murder in Indianapolis, he was checked to see if he might be the murderer of Mahoma Ridings. Until this day, the person who killed the corporal and the mysterious lady in black, who possibly knew who killed Mahoma, or who was complicit in her murder, have yet to be identified. The Claypool Hotel was razed in 1969. However, before this took place, another gruesome murder was committed in July 1954 in room 665. The lingerie-clad body of 19-year-old Dorothy Poor was found stuffed into a dresser drawer. She had been a car hop living in Clinton and had come to Indianapolis looking for work. She had been dead several days when she was discovered by a maid who was attracted by the smell of the putrefying remains. The drawer measured 48 inches by 24 inches and approximately 10 inches deep. Dr. Storms, the medical examiner, said it was a terrific task which he believed took 2 persons to jam the body into the drawer. Dorothy's clothes were found in the dark recesses of the closet by the water pipes and air vents which came into the room. Firemen with gas masks took the body from the drawer. The coroner estimated that she had been dead approximately 36 hours when she was found, and that the heat wave experienced in the city that summer had aided in the rapid decomposition and produced a horrid stench that caused the entire 6th floor to be evacuated. Air conditioning was being installed in the hotel, but the 6th floor had not been worked on yet. The hotel manager said the room had last been occupied by a man who registered as John O'Shea from New York, who it turned out gave a fictitious name and address. After the murder was discovered, he disappeared. The police believe that Dorothy Poor had been lured to the hotel with a promise of a job, and then suffocated with a pillow once she was inside the room. Dorothy was supposed to take a civil service exam the following Thursday for a typist job. Her mother Lily worked as a waitress, and on occasion Dorothy helped her there, but she also worked at the Mills Barbecue. She had come to Indianapolis from Clinton with hopes of a better job. Dorothy Poor was last seen going up in the Claypool elevator shortly before midnight. Her bed at the Lorraine Hotel had not been slept in since Thursday night. John O'Shea was described as a very short, blond man. He was well dressed and estimated to be in his mid-30s. When 2 maids came to the room on Friday, July 16th, he was sitting on the bed and pointed out a spot of blood on the bed and told them he had sinus trouble and his nose bled. One of the maids, Helen Curry, said that O'Shea seemed wild-eyed when we went in there. He said he wanted the room cleaned up because my mother is coming to visit me. Ironically, O'Shea, which would turn out to be named Lively, in reality had lost his mother Sadie Lively 3 months before in April 1954. His father died in 1951. The police got a break on the case when Charles Griffo, a reporter from the Indianapolis Star, theorized that John O'Shea had registered at another hotel under his real name. It was discovered that a Victor Lively stayed at the Kirkwood Hotel using a slightly different address than the one he used at the Claypool. A comparison of the handwriting proved it was the same person. On July 22nd, a tentative ID was made on John O'Shea. He was believed to be a former Indianapolis laundry worker with a Texas drawl. A vice president of the Star Laundry and Dry Cleaners told police that a man known as Victor Lively had worked at his establishment for about a week 3 years before. He told police the guy was crazy about women, would whistle and yell at them as they walked down the street. On the day Lively checked into the Claypool Hotel, a woman with circles under her eyes and dressed in a green checkered dress came twice looking for him. It was believed later this woman would procure prostitutes for men staying in the different hotels. Possibly she was in cahoots with a taxi driver who used the code name of Flag. Lively was arrested on July 23rd outside of St. Louis. He didn't resist but carried a .32 caliber gun wrapped in a newspaper. Shortly after his arrest, Lively confessed to the murder and said it took place after an argument ensued because Dorothy demanded gin and he only had whiskey. She had taunted him. They had sex, and then she started to scream, and he blacked out. He said that he couldn't remember what happened, but it was daytime when he came to. He found her passed out on the bed, and when he tried to revive her with a cold towel, she started gurgling and he panicked when she died. He then changed his story and said that he had killed her after she refused his sexual advances. He tried to rape her 3 times before strangling her. Despite his claims of panicking, Lively had paid the hotel bill until Monday, giving him sufficient time to leave town before the body was discovered. Ironically, a few days before Dorothy Poor was strangled, the room where Maoma Readings was killed had been remodeled, which included tearing up the murder room and connecting it with adjoining quarters. Employees from both hotels identified Victor Lively as the man who had called himself John O'Shea. It turned out that Lively had hitchhiked to East St. Louis on July 1st and went to work for a roofing contractor. He was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, but grew up in Beaumont, Texas, the foster son of Jack and Sadie Lively. In 1949, Alma Lee Lively sued for divorce from Victor Lively. This was the end of one of his 6 marriages. Whether the rest were common law is unknown. He had fathered a child with one of his wives. Around those years, he worked as a roughneck in the Texas oil fields. Since mid-July, when Lively had checked into the Corkwood Hotel, 6 blocks away from the Claypool, he had been on an incessant hunt for girls. Within days of the murder of Dorothy Poor, Carolyn Pickering, a reporter for the Indianapolis Star, posed as a country girl named Marilyn King, who had just come to the city for better opportunities. She arrived at the bus terminal around 6 p.m. and within 2 hours had been propositioned by at least 6 men, lured into registering at the York Hotel, had refreshments at a restaurant bar by a man who promised to do right by you, was shadowed by a well-dressed man who tried to arrange a meeting later in the Claypool Hotel, and was told by a truck driver who tried to pet, telling her, "Everybody does a little petting in public in the city." She said this occurred at the Traction Terminal, which was full of policemen. During a 20-minute walk down South Illinois Street, which was the city's Skid Row, 3 drivers and a motorcyclist pulled to the curb and offered her a ride. This included a man old enough to be her grandfather who wanted to have a drink with her. A half-block away, police stood talking to 2 streetwalkers. Her experience, which she wrote up for the newspaper, made it evident that what Dorothy Poor had encountered when she came to Indianapolis. Lillian Dancy, Dorothy's grandmother, told police and reporters that Dorothy was cautioned by a fortune teller to stay away from Indianapolis. She faced death upstairs in a building, and she was never to go back to Indianapolis. She was going to meet a person with light coloring that would grab her by the head and take her pocketbook. During the investigation, the authorities in Indianapolis referred to the fact that Lively was an offender involved in many sex cases and often had lured girls to hotel rooms. Lively told police he was a contact man for a white slave ring who was tasked with seducing girls and bringing them into prostitution rings. The police had more trouble finding the woman Ruth, who was the companion that came with Dorothy when she visited the murder room. She was described as a tall woman with large breasts, reddish-brown hair, which she combed to the side to cover a scar over the right side of her forehead. She also had a scar just above her left knee. Lively went to trial in November. On December 2nd, 1954, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Indiana State Penitentiary. The prosecutor had demanded the electric chair. During the trial, Lively identified Ruth as Grace Lawson, 26, a burlesque dancer. When she was found, she denied any knowledge of the case. In 1955, Griffith, the reporter who had helped the police, was awarded the Pall Mall Big Story Award for his role in solving the case. In 1956, the Claypool was robbed at gunpoint of $2,520. The area of the Claypool Hotel had become seedier since the years it had been the prestigious Bates House, which welcomed politicians including the President of the United States. In 1967, a fire started in one of the closets, forcing the hotel to close its doors. 2 years later, it was razed. Lively was paroled on January 25, 1980, and died in February 1981. In 2001, a man paid $5 for the brass drawer pulls from the dresser drawer where Dorothy Poor was stuffed. The auction was held by the daughter of the hotel's longtime general manager, Brian Carr. His wife had kept the drawer pulls as a macabre memento. The bidder specialized in architectural antiques. Present day, the site of the Claypool is the Embassy Suites downtown. The 7th floor has a reputation for being haunted. Employees complain of feelings of being watched and just an overall feeling of dread. It's anyone's guess who's causing those unnerving moments, but we can think of 2. There you go. So, I don't know. Even though Mahoma was, their murders were 10 years apart, something like that. You get this feeling that there was some type of prostitution or something going on there, something weird was going on there. And I can see where They're trying to lure the young country girl and mama writing. She came from a very good family, but she wanted to party and have a good time. But something, it's really weird. Like, who was the lady in black? Was it a lover or somebody that used the stairs? But then again, you think she had only been in her room like, what, 3 hours? She had checked in for only 3 hours? For somebody to know she was going to be in that seventh floor room? I don't know. Very interesting case. All right. Next story is also out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled The Killing Ground at Centerwood Avenue. On May 16, 1980, Teresa Fillingham, 16, was reported missing to the Tampa Police Department. On April 3, 1981, several human remains were recovered from the property of Billy Mansfield. On July 20th, 2022, with the help of DNA evidence, one of the skeletons was confirmed as belonging to Teresa. William Billy Mansfield Jr. was the eldest of 5 children, born to a father who was a convicted child molester. He joined the Army as a teenager after altering his birth certificate. While serving, he became addicted to alcohol and drugs. In 1975, he lived in Michigan and married Phyllis Spielmaker. His family was originally from Grand Rapids. His wife described Mansfield as a closeted bisexual who often brought men home that he picked up at gay bars and engaged in sex with them in front of her. He once discussed a murder with her. She said he was easygoing, however, when drunk, he would become violent. By the time they divorced in 1979, he had returned to his family home in Florida. In 1975, Elaine Ziegler, 15, an Ohio native, was vacationing with her family in a campground near Brooksville, Florida. She was last seen walking to the showers. Initially, after she disappeared, it was thought she was a runaway. Several witnesses described seeing her talking to a younger man near the shower area and getting into his light blue 1966 Ford Fairlane with Florida plates. The family went to bed not realizing until the next morning she had not returned. All her belongings were left behind. The only thing missing was her hairdryer, which she had taken to the showers. The search led nowhere, and Elaine appeared to have dropped off the face of the earth. 2 years later, Billy Mansfield pled guilty to a sexual misconduct charge against a babysitter. He received a sentence of 6 months and 36 months probation. Shortly after serving his prison term, he raped two teenagers, ages 15 and 16, at knife point in a rural area of Grand Rapids, Michigan. He committed the crime on the second anniversary of Ziegler's disappearance. He was sent back to jail for violating his probation. His cellmate during this jail stint was Albert Lee III, also known as Lloyd Blackjack, 27, who told him he murdered Linda Vanderveen, age 11, a school crossing guard who was abducted from her post in February 1979. Lee was arrested 6 weeks after Vanderveen's body was found in a snowbank. Her uniform tie was used to strangle her. Mansfield used this information to testify against Lee in exchange for a lesser sentence. He served only 1 year. Later that year, Albert Lee was convicted, but it was overturned because hypnosis had been used on the witnesses. 12 years later, a second trial ended with a conviction of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life without parole. In a 2009 prison interview, Lee denied killing Vanderveen, telling the reporter that police planted evidence in his car. By then, Linda's parents and her brother were dead. In 2022, he was still serving his sentence. As of December 26, 2022, Albert Lee is reflected in the records of the Michigan Department of Correction as discharged, which means he's no longer under the jurisdiction of MDOC, even though he was sentenced to life in 1991 for murder in the first degree. Born in 1951, in 2024 he would be about 72 years old, and his whereabouts are unknown. Once Billy Mansfield was released, he returned to Florida, and in June 1980, Mansfield forced Pamela Sherrill, 18, into his van, then drove to a trailer where he lived. He proceeded to beat her. She reported the attack to the police, but he had fled when they went to the location. 5 months later, he was arrested in Santa Cruz, California, but he posted bail and was a free man once more. In November 1981, the body of Renee Saling, 29, a mother of 3, was found off a road in Watsonville, California. She was partially nude with her blouse torn and pants lowered to her ankles. She was raped and strangled to death, but her body was also riddled with bullets. The police said she was killed elsewhere and dumped where passing motorists found the body in a drainage ditch leading between the bar and the KOA campground where the Mansfield brothers were renting a trailer. Later it was determined she met Billy Mansfield at the Wooden Nickel 2 bar, and they left together in his green Oldsmobile Toronado. Mansfield was reportedly working at a mushroom farm in Santa Cruz. Witnesses testified she was drunk when she arrived at the bar around 10 p.m., looking for her husband Raymond. He saw her first and hid in the bathroom to avoid a confrontation. Within minutes of arriving, the manager threw her out because she was so intoxicated. Sometime after this, she hooked up with Mansfield. Less than a week later, Billy and his brother Gary, 23, were arrested in Nevada for questioning in Saling's murder. Despite lying about their identity, they matched the description of the Mansfield brothers, and they were arrested. Both were arraigned on murder charges. The media called them the Bag Brothers, since they wore paper bags over their heads to hide their appearance. They pled not guilty to the charges. November 1980 was not a good month for the Mansfield boys. William Mansfield Sr., an air conditioning repairman, was sentenced to 30 years in prison for sex crimes involving young girls. He was originally charged with 40 sex offenses, but the charges were dropped in a plea bargain with prosecutors, and he was convicted of only 4 sex-related crimes. He pled no contest to 3 counts of lewd and lascivious assault on a child under 14, and 1 count of soliciting a minor for prostitution. Another one of his sons, Robbie Mansfield, 18, was arrested in Brooksville on a charge of burglary of a dwelling and grand theft of a rifle. William Mansfield Sr. was released in 2005 based on his good behavior after serving a third of his sentence, even though the Florida Parole Commission had concluded in 2004 that he was a risk to society and voted to keep him behind bars. William Mansfield's crimes included sex acts with dozens of children, including one girl who was just 9 months old when the abuse began. In March 1981, an anonymous tip led the Hernando County Sheriff's Department to secure a warrant to excavate a 6-acre property belonging to the Mansfield family in Spring Hill, Florida. Virginia Mansfield, mother of Billy, Robbie, and Gary, still lived in a trailer house along with her stepmother and 3 other sons. The family had moved to the property from Michigan in 1970. Digging among the junk that littered the grounds 10 feet from the trailer, the first discovery was made. They found a skull and a hip bone covered by a blanket in a shallow graveyard. The bones appeared to belong to a child between the age of 9 and 12. The skeleton was lying on its side in a fetal position. The other bones were found, and examination by a pathologist concluded they belonged to a female under 20 years of age. Then a second set of remains were tentatively identified as those of Elaine Ziegler, missing since 1975. The excavation continued, turning up cow and chicken bones. A week later, under a fireplace, a small sack of bones were found. These were later determined to belong to an animal. 2 more skeletons belonging to young women were unearthed. Soon identified were the remains of Sandra Jean Graham, 21, a divorcee who had disappeared from the parking lot of Pam's Liquor Lounge in Tampa the year before. She was seen in the company of a man described as a biker. A dental comparison confirmed who she was. It was determined she had been strangled with electrical wire. The skulls of the other 2 Jane Does were sent for reconstruction, but no matches were made. October 1981, Billy Mansfield escaped with the aid of another prisoner, but within 12 hours they were arrested. When Mansfield's trial began in July 1981, the prosecutor read from a letter he had sent to his mother. It read, "There are certain circumstances from which God seems to have sent himself, concrete circumstances of violent action and response from which there is no retreat, and in which man is left alone and in darkness to make his own life or death decisions." While being held in California, he was indicted for the murder of one of the 4 victims found on his property. He was also charged with attempted sexual battery of Pamela Sherrill. During his 1982 trial, his brother Gary and a woman known as Cindy testified against him. For his cooperation, conspiracy charges against Gary Mansfield were dropped. Billy Mansfield was convicted of Saling's murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. He then pled guilty to all 4 Florida homicides and was given 4 life terms as part of a plea bargain. In 1982, during Mansfield's trial for the Florida murders, Peggy Oates Knight, 22, described the night when Elaine Ziegler disappeared. She said that Elaine believed Mansfield would help her run away from home. Knight lived near the KOA campsite adjacent to the Mansfield property. She had become friends with Elaine, who she described as a loner, very quiet. She always walked around like she had problems. The evening before she disappeared, she told Knight she wanted to run away because her stepfather had made sexual advances towards her. She testified that Elaine said the man had sexual relations with her. She didn't want to tell her mother because she had just married her stepfather. Elaine Ziegler told Knight she'd met someone named Billy who was going to take her south to Miami and take care of her. Soon after the conversation, Mansfield showed up at the recreation room. He was filthy. Knight said she warned Ziegler not to leave with him, but she went anyway. She said that Mansfield's eyes were dark, piercing, and extremely dilated. His eyes looked so black, like they looked right through you. It was frightening, very scary, she said. Fast forward to October 2020, when police arrived at Gary Mansfield's home at 3442 Roundup Lane, situated behind his parents' house. A search warrant yielded equipment for a meth lab and illegal drugs. The 62-year-old was subsequently arrested on several drug possession and distribution charges. They said they located items on a nearby property that were deemed to be suspicious. This led to a search of the Mansfield property on Centerwood Avenue in the Weeki Wachee Acres neighborhood, where remains were unearthed in 1981. It was known as the House of Horrors by neighbors. Ironically, the Mansfield property is less than 500 feet from a church called Iglesia de Dios Corona, or the Church of God's Crown. On July 20th, 2022, one of the Jane Does unearthed in 1981 finally was given a name. She is Teresa Caroline Fillingham. She disappeared a week from her 17th birthday. Her sister reported her missing on May 16, 1980. Her remains were sent to different labs through the years, but not until 2020 were they ever able to develop a DNA profile. In 2022, a new technique was used on the sample, and with the information developed, it was compared to her sister, which confirmed her identity. Her sister, Margaret Johns, who lives in Cape Coral, Florida, had been made aware the year before that they tentatively had found her sister's remains, but confirmation was made in 2022. She felt that her family members were cheated of this closure since many of them had passed away. Billy Mansfield is up for parole this year. John said if she had to fly out there and testify herself to keep him from getting out, then that's what she'll do. Court documents said all the women found in 1981 on the Mansfield property were sexually assaulted by both Billy Mansfield, his younger brother Gary, and their father William Mansfield Sr. It was Mansfield Jr. who would then kill them and sometimes dismember them. Mansfield's mother, Virginia, died in 2018. As of 2023, he is serving his sentence at California Healthcare Facility Stockton. Through the years, he's been denied parole, the last time in 2012. In 2022, he voluntarily waived the right to a hearing for 3 years, and his next hearing is scheduled for August 2025. The fourth set of remains unearthed in 1981 is still a Jane Doe. What was left of her was a near-complete skeleton. According to the 1981 anthropology report, the remains were wrapped in some kind of red-green blanket. The blanket was approximately 4 by 6 feet. Near the body was a ceramic pendant approximately 1 inch in diameter, aqua blue in color. There's a drawing on the front of the pendant of a pink heart with a red smaller heart within. Yellow wings extend from the small red heart, then 13 yellow lines. On the back of the pendant are blue letters EE and possibly a P. In July 2023, Terry Mansfield was arrested on a charge of child sexual battery on a child under 12 years of age. This is a brother of Billy, by the way. In 2005, he was charged with aggravated battery with a deadly weapon against David Bell. This crime took place at the family's Centerwood Avenue address. In January 2024, Billy Mansfield confessed to killing Carol Ann Barrett, 18, in 1980, when she visited Daytona Beach for spring break. She had accompanied school friends from Ohio, and she was kidnapped by an unknown person from the Treasure Island Motel, which has since been demolished. Her body was found the next day along I-95 near Jacksonville, Florida. Even with a sketch of the suspect using a friend's information, the case grew cold. In 2017, it was reopened and Mansfield became a suspect. He confessed that he was the man in the sketch and had killed Barrett. The state attorney's office will not seek prosecution as Mansfield is currently in a California prison serving a life sentence for murder, as well as 4 concurrent life sentences in Florida for murder in separate cases. So there you go. In other words, they had all these murders because of what was found on their property in Centerwood Avenue. But they're realizing that there were other bodies. I guess I would have to. Does this guy remember this guy was in Florida? Well, he lived in Florida, spent time in Florida. Would go to Michigan and also California. Possibly he could have killed other people along the way. Like this one that he just admitted to, what, maybe 6-7 months ago. So there you go. And I will be back soon with some more interesting news of the unusual, aka Eerie News. Until next time.